Good evening and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960 AM. I've got an interesting person for you to meet tonight, and that's Celina Chavannes, who is a fascinating individual because she's a consultant, she's an equity and inclusion advocate, and she's a mental health champion, and she's a former parliamentarian. She was actually principal secretary to Prime Minister Trudeau at one point in time, decided to not run in the last election, and is now in the private sector. And I thought that there would be a bunch of different reasons we'd want to chat with her. Number one, she's obviously got a lot of knowledge in mental health and in pharmaceuticals and clinical trials. But also one of the things that's really happened of late is a lot of the statistics are coming out that COVID-19 is impacting the Black community far more impactfully than it is everyone else. And I'd like to chat with her about that. In fact, there was a report in a US magazine today that called COVID-19 the Black Plague, which I thought was pretty extreme, but frankly, it's one of those issues that we got to talk about. So Celina, how are you? Welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate you having me on. And I appreciate this time we're going to spend together. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to meet you all over again. So tell me, let's just from an overview standpoint, what about this issue about COVID-19 being so much more dramatically impactful on the Black community? What's this all about?
So I'm really glad that we have an opportunity to talk about this, because I don't think in Canada, where we don't collect disaggregated data based on race, we have an opportunity to really discuss the impact that disease, especially COVID-19, could have on individuals who have pre-existing conditions. So you mentioned at the top that I know about clinical trials. My past life before getting into politics was as an individual who owned a healthcare-based research management firm. And I operated many clinical trials across Canada and the United States, and in particular was known for speaking internationally about the inclusion of marginalized communities in clinical trials. And because physicians who tend to be male and Caucasian who operate clinical trials don't tend to invite other demographics to participate, we tend to have skewed numbers when it comes to looking at how medications impact people. But when we're looking at this particular disease, when we're looking at different comorbid conditions, diabetes, hypertension, etc., that predominantly impact the Black community, we're finding a disproportionately negative impact of COVID-19 on Black communities, but that it goes beyond that to now, racialized communities.
Could I ask you a question on that? Because this has been, one of the issues that I've had with a couple of different people that have been reporting on this in the United States. It's not a racial issue. It's a lifestyle issue or a poverty issue, is it not? It's so the core morbidity issues of hypertension and diabetes are primarily associated with people that have poor eating habits, may be in poverty, may not have good health care, etc. So it's not a racial thing; it's more of an income thing, is it not?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's an income thing, because then it puts the onus on the person who's being impacted. I would say it's a systems issue. If a system was able to adequately and equitably address the issues within that system, whether we're talking about poverty or education or a justice system or healthcare outcomes, if there was equity in the system, we wouldn't have these huge disparities once a pandemic hits. So looking at the system as a whole, when we have limited resources, how do we adequately put those limited resources in spaces where we know it can have the best impact?
Okay,
and
so maybe I described my question wrong, but I think that the statistics of the rest of the community and the Black community may be different in Canada versus the United States because of our public health system in Canada, where people from all different income levels may get good health care in Canada. While I've lived in the United States, I think you have as well. You don't get great health care in the United States if you're at a lower income level.
Well, and I'm not saying that poverty doesn't have a huge impact. What I'm saying is the system is designed so that people who are at a lower socioeconomic level also have various conditions or various access points to healthcare or justice or education that further compound a situation, and it makes their poverty worse, makes their health outcomes worse, makes their access to justice, et cetera, worse. So when you have a pandemic such as we have right now, their outcome in terms of their ability to get great health care is also worse.
Having this major newspaper in the United States calling it the Black Plague, is that at all appropriate?
I would say that whereas people might cringe at the sort of the hyperbole, you might call it, of use of that term, I would say if we need to draw attention to a situation in which attention is not being drawn, sometimes you need to be a little dramatic.
Yeah.
And in this particular case, when you have a disparity in a healthcare system that is further exacerbated by a pandemic, then if you want to call it the Black Plague to bring attention to it, so be it.
We're chatting tonight with Celina Caesar Chavannes,
Yeah.
A former parliamentarian and a mental health expert and a equity inclusion advocate. We're going to take a short break for messages and come back with her in just a minute. Stay with us.
Hello?
Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Celina Caesar Chavannes, who is a consultant, equity and inclusion advocate, mental health champion, former parliamentarian, former parliamentary secretary to Prime Minister Trudeau, which I can ask her about because I think that would have been a fascinating situation for her to live through. Though she chose not to run again, and is now on our radio show to our benefit. And Celina, I think that you've had a fair amount of experience, as you mentioned in our first segment, in clinical trials. And we've just heard information. A friend of mine just told me about clinical trials starting at Oxford University in the UK. There's a couple of Canadian companies that have banded together to do clinical trials. It seems like a race in the United States. How are these clinical trials going to be run? Because really what we need to do is we've got to subject them to people that presumably don't have COVID-19 and then are going to be infected with COVID-19. How does that, and see if the vaccine works. How does this actually work? How do you do this ethically?
So let's just sort of set some parameters. Most clinical trials run in a way in which some people either get a controlled substance, so like you're looking at a new drug versus a Tylenol, something that's already established. In this particular case, when we have something that is novel, it's new, and we need to test it against something that we don't have, we would need to put that in a live human being. Likely the clinical trials have gone through the animal phase, so there's 4 phases of clinical trials. By the time it gets to the human studies, it has gone through all the safety and efficacy testing, and it usually takes months. In this particular case, when we're dealing with a pandemic, that will have to be truncated, so timelines will have to be pushed a little bit further because people's lives depend on it. But it is still a very rigorous process by which pharmaceutical companies would choose to go into human trials. There is Health Canada and the FDA, the EMEA have to have approvals for that to happen.
Okay, but we're talking about a vaccine. So it's a vaccine for COVID-19. And so presumably you've got to have some people that in one arm are going to be subjected with COVID-19 and have this potential vaccine, and in another arm are going to be subjected to COVID-19 and are not going to have this vaccine. And how do you actually do that?
So I'm not going to speak. I'm not going to speak to how they're going to randomize or control the clinical trial, because they may do that or they may decide to put it in individuals who are affected. So I don't know how they're going to design the trial. If they do decide to design it with a control of a healthy population versus a unhealthy population or a population that does have COVID, again, those have to go through very rigorous parameters. And I would say right now, with the state of the world in having hundreds of thousands of cases of individuals where that could potentially die, I would say that, you know, having a clinical trial come to fruition as quickly as possible is necessary, but you do need to ensure that the safety and efficacy of whichever medication, whether it's a medication that's already in existence or a new medication, is right for the condition that you're treating it for, in which this case is COVID-19.
Now, I've been surprised that people have been saying that they've been rushing potential vaccines into trial already. You know, on the news in the last couple of days, people have been talking about a vaccine being a year away potentially. What's your sense of when we might be able to get a vaccine?
I would say, I think we've had cases like SARS, like MERS, where we've had to, I don't say we like I have, but, human beings, very smart people, smarter than I have had to develop vaccines to deal with very specific issues in a very short timeline, and we've seen some success with that. I think what we're seeing is a number of different medications that have been used for pre-existing conditions being reused now to treat COVID-19. And remember, we've had this in the past where we've had, Viagra that was supposed to be used for a heart medication being used for erectile dysfunction. So this is not something that is novel. It's a case where we're testing a very specific entity against a specific disease, and hopefully we have something that's already been tested by the FDA, by Health Canada, by the EMEA that we can use for this particular case.
So you've been in politics and you've been in health and clinical trials. What do you think about this controversy in regards to a president out talking about a drug that he's almost recommending people use off-label to solve their COVID-19 infection problems?
So we've seen the tragedy of sort of jumping to conclusions around hearsay. In the clinical, if I could rewind a little bit, in order to bring a new drug to market, any new drug for conditions that we often study for years, it takes 12 years to bring a new drug entity. And that's after looking at hundreds of thousands of different particles. We pick one particle, test it for 12 years, and billions of dollars, like we're talking tens of billions of dollars into that one, to bring that one drug to market, again, through those 4 phases of clinical trials. For someone, anyone, and particularly a president or a head of state of a country, to presumably say that this hearsay or this anecdotal evidence is relevant and have other people use it, I think is irresponsible. And there isn't enough science to back it up. I'll put it in the hands of the health experts and the scientists, of which I am not one. I could speak to what I know, but I think there's way smarter people than the President of the United States who could bring this information to people who need it.
I think that's excellent advice. So it's interesting that the FDA, though, has been far more rapid, and President Trump and other people on the podium have been bragging about how the FDA in the United States, the Federal Drug Administration, have been far more rapid in their review and approval of some of the, maybe not drugs, but at least the testing of COVID-19. I interviewed a company called Spartan Bioscience just last week in Canada, in Ottawa, that have developed a handheld DNA test for COVID-19. And they were saying that Health Canada wasn't changing any of their programs and processes in regards to the timing of approval. In such a time, should our regulatory agencies be able to work far quicker? And is there a way to get that to happen?
Absolutely. And this is what I've said before. This has happened before. This is not something that is new to the system. This is something that has happened before. It happens when we have orphan drugs, when we have new therapies that we need to sort of push to market because it is impacting on a large scale or a small number of people. We've had this happen before, where Health Canada and other regulatory bodies, as well as ethics bodies, so it's not just going through a regulatory process where you go through a Health Canada, FDA, or EMEA in Europe, but you also have ethics bodies, of which I've sat on the ethical review board at the University of Toronto and other institutions to review the ethics of the research. So there are 2 separate and distinct bodies that look through it. Yes, in this particular case where you have so many people dying so rapidly in a fast-changing disease, all hands are on deck for this. So there isn't a lag time. This is a time where we need to have all hands on deck to ensure that we have a vaccine to save lives. But that doesn't mean we do it without caution, without ensuring the safety and efficacy of the medication.
So let's connect these two conversations we've had. We had one conversation about race and the impact of COVID-19 on
Yes.
races and or different income levels or poverty. And then we've also had this conversation about clinical trials. Let's connect the two of them.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of controversy about clinical trials on whether they're studied on males or males and females and people on different races. Given that COVID-19 appears to have a far bigger impact on the Black community, should these trials ensure that there's people of different races and different genders in the trials, and should they track those different responses, and should they report on whether it's impactful on these different races and or genders?
So absolutely, and this has been something that I've been speaking about for years. I used to speak at the Drug Information Association. I was chair of a couple of sessions speaking about the marginalized groups being a part of or more involved in clinical trials. And it used to be anecdotal that, the Black community, Latino communities, persons of different sexual orientation, different gender, different abilities, so we're talking about the marginalized group, didn't trust clinical trials. And that is absolutely not true. They've just not been asked. So the invitation to participate needs to be foremost, and it needs to come from physicians who are conducting the clinical trials. But even before that, and if you don't mind, I want to sort of back up, because if we're not collecting disaggregated data, race-based data, gender data around what are the outcomes of COVID-19, how do we know that the resources we're putting into this or combating this disease are going to the right places? Again, and I know what the World Health Organization said, that this disease doesn't discriminate, it impacts everybody, but phenotypically and genetically, people are different. Their comorbid diseases are different. Their genetical displacement to get certain conditions are different. So you need to, if you know that one community is more predisposed to getting hypertension and diabetes, how does that impact COVID? And we're not looking at that here in Canada. I think it's critically important that our federal or our provincial government decides to make this a priority.
So if I go on any of these websites for COVID-19, I can track by different age group, I can track by different sex, I can track by different countries. You're saying in addition, I should be able to track by different races. And then, let me ask you, there's so much talk about racial profiling and how that's a negative in policing. Why is it negative in policing and positive in healthcare?
So when we start lumping things all into one big basket, that's when we have problems. So again, right now, we have a state where we as a Black community understand that we have been profiled by the justice system for years. There's an overpopulation of Black and Indigenous communities in our federal and provincial prison system. So there's an issue with that, and that is going to increase. Hopefully not, but it has the potential to increase when we have people being monitored right now, right? But we understand that data exists. We understand that because we've studied it.
Yeah.
So why can't we study the outcomes where there's a positive impact for these communities, for racialized communities or gendered communities or individuals with disabilities? Why can't we study that same impact when it's positive, when there could be a positive outcome? It's the same thing. We're collecting the same data. It's about checking just a couple other boxes. Why can't we do that?
Okay, but then take my argument for a second. Maybe it's race related, and you're certainly suggesting that it may be. But if I'm right, that it's lifestyle related, that it's people that have pre-existing conditions for diabetes and things like that, and that leads, that's either poverty or it's bad diet or bad lifestyle, and that might be the impact. You start taking statistics like that, then you start to tell people that how they live ends up being a criteria on whether they're going to get sick or sicker, and whether they're more susceptible to get diseases like this. Is that right?
So, I mean, and that's where I think I said at the beginning, when we look at our systems, when we look at, you know, wages, for example, in this country, when we look at living wages, when we look at education system, when we look at justice system, when we look at housing, when we look at a number of different factors that go into why people are in poverty and how they remain in that system, then there's responsibility that doesn't just fall on one individual. It falls on everybody who is part of that system to make that change. And if we're just going to continue to blame the individual and say, well, you just need to get off your butt and start walking around and then you won't have diabetes. Well, what contributes to that within the system? What if they try to change, but the system itself doesn't allow for that change? What if they try to access a healthcare system, but they're treated as drug addicts instead of being somebody in pain in that system? Where does that responsibility lie? It doesn't just fall on the individual. There's responsibilities that lie in more than one place.
Okay, and so that goes to my point that I think that that one of the outcomes of this whole pandemic may frankly be that even Americans see that the Canadian public healthcare system is a far better system than the U.S. system, and effectively testing and dealing with COVID-19 in the United States is being dealt with from what I can see, at least in New York State and maybe New Jersey, as a public healthcare system rather than their current system, and they're shipping patients between the private hospitals and the public hospitals, and there's no co-pays that are being applied, et cetera, et cetera. So it becomes a system comparable to ours. That said, you know, there is lifestyle issues and diet and
sure.
and exercise, and lots of people have said what we have in Canada, what we have in the United States, is a sick care system, not a healthcare system. We deal with people when they get sick rather than trying to help them keep healthy.
Protection.
What are we going to do with people that refuse to have healthy lifestyles? Anything? Because clearly what's happening is those people are more susceptible, because they have diabetes or they're obese, they're clearly more susceptible to COVID-19.
So in some cases, I would agree with you, but in others, I think we cannot paint everybody within a particular group with the same brush. We have to understand that individuals, Black, white, Latina, whatever, have various different genetic composition that allows them to be more predisposed or genetically predisposed to a number of conditions. And so when we just say, well, it's up to you as the individual, you could change your lifestyle. You, Celina, are depressed because you don't go outside and you don't do this. Well, I mean, I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think, again, if we're going to put limited resources that we have into fixing the weakest part of our system, we have to look at it holistically. And we can't just say, well, that person needs to fix themselves and I absolve myself from all responsibility. It really is an all in this together when we look at a COVID-19 situation where we have to be working together and not blaming the victim to say, fix it, while I sit here and wait for you to do that.
Well, we're having a fascinating conversation tonight with Celina Caesar Chavannes, no S, Chavannes, I apologize. Stay with us for a minute while we take some messages, and we can come back more with Celina in just a minute. Stay with us.
3.
Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour in Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Celina Caesar Chavannes, who is a incredibly interesting person. We've had a fascinating conversation so far. She's an equity advocate. She's a public health expert. She's run clinical trials in the past. She's been a parliamentarian. And we were just talking about mental health and the impact on on mental health of COVID-19. And Celina, I just, if I can call you Celina, I hope, I just read a statistic that antidepressant medications are up 22%. So obviously a lot of people are having challenges with the stress and pressure, the fear, the panic associated with COVID-19, and or the lack of stress, staying at home in social isolation. Have we thought enough about the mental health impacts of this pandemic?
I think we're starting to think about it. I think one of the things that we need to consider is that 1 in 5 Canadians are impacted by mental health, which means all Canadians are impacted, because I think as a family of 5 myself, it's not because I have it that I'm the only one impacted. The people around me are impacted as well. I go through the winter months and it's usually quite difficult. I look forward to the spring, and here we are in spring and we are told that we have to stay inside. And the impact of that alone, we are social individuals, we are social beings, and we told that we cannot have connections with people for, kids are in school till April, they're not, no, till May, no, till the end of May. So we're further and further separating ourselves, and the impact of that, especially on people who live in 500 square foot apartments in Toronto, this has to be very challenging to people who don't have mental health issues. But when you compound major depressive disorder or anxiety like I have, it really is a challenge. I've had a meeting with my psychiatrist every week, and I may see him once every 6 months, but every week since this has started. And I have a full support system here. There's some people that don't have it at all, and they look to go to work for that support, or they look to go out.
And if I was living in a 500 or 1,000 or a 1,200 square foot condominium or apartment building in downtown Toronto, and I was worried about getting into the elevator and pressing the buttons, and or getting in the elevator with any other person that might have had a sniffle or a cough, or as Prime Minister Trudeau talked, even spoke moistly, which is a great new word, I think. I'm not allowed to go walk in a park. I'm not allowed to go walk a waterfront trail. I'd be going nuts. So
this is it exactly. We, again, as normal as, and I use that term very loosely, I'm not saying that someone is abnormal, but as regular human beings, we want to be out. We want to, and as much as we may not want to go to work, it is an escape for us. We're looking at antidepressants rising. We're looking at the number of gender-based violence rising. We're looking at other issues that socially we have not considered, that we really need to consider when you confine people to a small space, whether it's a home or a condo. We are confining people to be not as social as they normally would be. And have we thought this through? Have we thought out what isolation actually means to some people who are in very precarious situations, either with their own mental health or with partners around them that are not the best individuals?
So the article I read this morning said that people die of loneliness. And what we're doing is we're subjecting a whole bunch of people, whether they're singles in condominiums downtown Toronto, or they're elderly people in old folks' homes. We're subjecting them to loneliness like they've never experienced before.
Absolutely. And again, have we thought through what this means for the long term? Have we thought through the cuts that have been made to mental health? Have we thought through the sort of patchwork of investments that have been made here and there in mental health? And have we thought through what happens after people come outside? What happens after this pandemic? How we are going to change our systems to accommodate, to be better able to deal with individuals who are impacted by a number of social factors that are detrimental to their health.
Okay, so I had a psychologist on my show, I think a month ago, before COVID-19 became a big issue, frankly. And they talked about one of the best things you can do if you're feeling bad is go for what they called a forest bath. They talked about going out into nature and just allowing nature to surround you. And it was a bath of nature, of forests. We're not allowed to do that today. And we're closing down all of our parks and all of our waterfront trails because we can't trust people to go for a walk and not get together and not stay 6 feet away or more from other people. Is that the right decision? Last week there was a family charged in Oakville for rollerblading on a recreational center parking lot that was closed. I can't think of anything safer to do. It was the one family that lived together, so they're not sharing germs amongst them that they wouldn't have shared in the home elsewhere. The recreation center's parking lot was closed, and so therefore there was no cars on the recreation center parking lot. And effectively what the police were saying is go rollerblade on the street where there's cars and I won't ticket you. But by going there, you're doing something wrong. Like, what are we telling people?
So I have a very strong emotions when we talk about a sort of a police state, especially considering the over surveillance of Black and Indigenous communities. And I don't mean to make this a racial issue, but we've experienced this for quite some time. And so now we're in a state where everybody is being told that they can't go here and they can't go there. And yes, I believe that we need to obey the rules and the regulations out there. I believe that we need to stay at home to plank the curb. However, we are getting into a very particular situation when we are looking at taking away civil liberties that it really is problematic when we're doing that, and when we're fining people. And I mean, a warning, yes, fining, arresting, hitting, assaulting. I think there's a line that we cannot cross as a country, as a society, that we just can't cross, because I don't think we'll be able to get it back.
But we have crossed it. You know, you take a look at whether it's the press briefings in Canada or the White House press briefings, there's more than 5 people. They are distancing. They're sitting a row apart or a couple of chairs apart. But we're respecting them. We're saying they're smart enough to not shake hands, to not cough on each other, and to stay a reasonable distance apart from each other. And we're showing them on TV day after day after day. But for some reason, we are telling Canadians that they can't be trusted to go to church and stay far enough away from each other. They can't be trusted to go to a park and stay far enough away from another. And a family can't either rollerblade in a parking lot.
I feel that I think there's some situations where I actually have to scratch my head and think, I don't know what we're doing. Again, I think what our politicians, those in power, are thinking is they prefer to be overprotective and get this disease under control and plank the curb. I'm trying to think as I would have a couple of years ago in politics, and how best it is to plank that curb and to maybe have to set a few examples. Again, I just think when we're doing it in a way that is using the fullest force of our law, I don't think we could walk that back as nicely as we would like to. And I feel like we might be crossing a very, very fine line.
I'm worried we're crossing that line, and I'm worried that that we're not setting great examples, whether, you know, it's Prime Minister Trudeau going on a vacation with his kids, crossing provincial boundaries that's supposedly not allowed, or whether it's frankly Premier Ford, who's doing a wonderful job, but he's going out with a whole crowd of people and starting to move masks and other things. And so therefore it appears that rules apply to some people, but don't apply to others. And I think if we start having people that question the rules because they say it's dumb, I've got this big park in front of my building or my house, and I'm not allowed to go walking in it because there's a person at the front entrance that's taking down names and barricaded it, when the last thing I want to do is stay inside 100% of my time. I want to get out and enjoy nature. I worry that calls into question people's trust in government and law and authority.
Well, I think it calls it into question, but there's been a lot of communities that have been existing like this for quite some time. And it may have not been one in which, you know, the whole country is alert to it. But again, you have an overrepresentation of certain populations, Black and Indigenous, in our justice system, because this has been how they've been policed and experienced the justice system. So if we want to sort of get to a point where we're able to come out of COVID-19 in the same way as we're looking at disparities in health and we're looking at disparities in health outcomes, we need to look at disparities across the system and systems and how people navigate those systems in order to, at the end of this, I think at the end of this, if we don't come out better than when we came in, then what was it all for? And we really need to understand, if we are going to be stopped by law enforcement when we go for a walk, when we're walking down the street, when we're walking with our family, well, people get carded for that a lot. So we need to understand, if we're going to fight for one, let's fight for all.
So you're saying that my overreaction to this is frankly something that you and your community have been dealing with forever. And maybe I'm just experiencing what you've been experiencing for a long period of time. And I just, for the first time in my life, realized what being carded would be like. And I don't like it one bit.
You said it.
So the other thing that's interesting that I think is very worrisome. One of the newspapers in Toronto called that we're turning into a nation of snitchers, because we're all snitching on each other when our neighbors, are breaking the rules. Is that positive?
Again, I don't know how to react to that question necessarily, because my life experience is somewhat different, where, we watch stories, and social media has done a great job of it, where our communities are called on when we show up in places. And yes, this is more in the United States than here, but we saw the story in Ottawa with the man who was walking with his daughter and was assaulted. So, we're turning into a nation of snitchers against it, as if this experience is new. This experience is not new to me necessarily.
Even though it is. Okay, that's interesting.
It's new. It's new. It's a new experience, maybe to some, but it's not a new experience in the total.
Well, we're having a fascinating conversation. At least I think it's fascinating, with Celina Chavannes. We're going to take a quick break for messages and come back for more in just a second. Stay with us.
Part 3 or part 4.
Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. We're on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 on your AM dial, or www.saga960am.ca. Tonight, we're chatting with Celina Chavannes, who is an advocate for equity. She's a former health expert, and she's also been an MP, a minister of a member of Parliament in Ottawa, and she was the parliamentary secretary to the Prime Minister. And I got to ask you, why aren't you in Ottawa today?
In October of 2019, I decided that I was not going to seek re-election. I sat for 4 years in the 42nd Parliament, and I thought that I started off as a Liberal, ended up as an independent, and I thought that was enough for me for now.
What was it like being the parliamentary secretary to the Prime Minister?
That was a fascinating position. It was, as a parliamentary secretary, you tag team with the Prime Minister or with your minister and attend meeting and events that they cannot attend. And for me, it was a experience which I grew a lot. I learned a lot. And it was quite fascinating to be in that position as someone who was a tag team, so to speak, with the Prime Minister of a G7 country.
I was very disappointed. We've met previously. I was very positive about you and the impact that you could have on politics. I was really disappointed when you retired, decided not to run again. What can we do to persuade you to change your mind? And is there any chance of that?
So I've had this conversation many times with people who have said, you should have stayed, you should have done this, you should have stayed for the pension, blah, blah, blah. And I just think that at the end of the day, it was a deeply personal decision to step away. I know that I had a lot of responsibility, not just to the people of Whitby, but to the people that I advocated for, of course, as you mentioned many times, for equity and inclusion, but also for mental health. And I just thought that I needed to step away at that particular time, just to sort of look back and reflect over what could have been done differently over those last 4 years. But I would say with certainty that a part of me really does want to go back, and if the conditions were right, I would certainly go back.
Well, if you decide to go back, let me know, because I want to come out and help you, and I'll donate to your campaign, and I'll go knock on doors for you, because I think you're spectacular.
Thank you.
So let me ask, if you were there, what would you be doing differently today?
You know what?
You were Minister of Health.
You know, I look at Patty, and I actually sent her a note a little while ago, just really saying that I appreciate the work that she's doing. The one thing that I did send a message to the Prime Minister's office very recently, was to talk about what we talked about earlier, and that is to start looking at disaggregated data. The Government of Canada, during the 42nd Parliament in the 2018 budget, put aside federal funding for StatsCan to have a Center for Gender, Inclusion, and Equity to look at some of this disaggregated data. Why aren't we doing that in a global pandemic? Why aren't we using the resources that we've already invested in to make sure that we're looking at outcomes, so that we're investing those limited resources that we have in a very specific way? I think it's silly not to.
You know, it's fascinating to me that up until just a few days ago, we hadn't even heard, at least I hadn't even heard, on any of the national media in the United States or Canada about this higher propensity within the Black community for COVID-19. We'd heard about females being, I think it's less than half of the incidence of males. We certainly heard about the age discrepancy, and that over 80, it's over 20% mortality, and under 8, it's almost 0% mortality. And we've heard about different countries, but we haven't heard up until very recently anything about race and or, as I've argued, lifestyle or income level, poverty. And so I think there are some other ways that we should be analyzing the incidents.
Well, I just think if we're going to be collecting data about this disease, again, global pandemic, this is where you differentiate leadership, where you know that there are issues. You've been told, you know, we've made previous investments in StatsCan to collect this kind of data. Why aren't we doing it? Why are we just, does it not poll well? Is it not something that's electable to talk about race in this particular context? Well, I think it's incumbent upon governments to say, hey, we understand that this phenomenon may exist. We're collecting the data anyway. Let's just look at it. This isn't about, oh, we're trying to segregate, or we're trying to be different, or we're trying to be difficult, or Celina, all you do is talk about race. This is not the case. This is about understanding that there are differences, and if you're collecting the data and you've already made the investment, why not use it? I
agree. And we are collecting more data at this time than ever before. And I think for the first time, I thought climate change was going to be the issue of our generation, but people weren't listening to the scientists, I feared. For once, people are actually listening to the scientists. And I think that we're potentially going to change people's attitudes, where, you know, this Tony Fauci guy is probably the most trusted man in the United States. And our public health people in Ontario and Canada are similarly incredibly well trusted. So maybe this is the time that we should be doing this analysis and collecting the data and doing the segmentation that you're talking about.
Well, if we do not want these disparities to grow, they already exist. They already, let's just put that nail in the hole. They already exist. If we do not want them to grow, if we do not want the disparities to get bigger, then let's just focus in on them for a minute, just for a minute. Just let's look at the data. Let's just collect a couple more pieces of data and analyze it. And if it says nothing, great. A lot of science says nothing. But a lot of science says some really key points that we need to pay attention to.
I think some of the things that came out in SARS are also potentially interesting. And so maybe we should, in addition to the things that you've been suggesting, thinking about tracking the data in condominiums. In SARS, there was this issue that maybe the infection, transferred through piping in the buildings. Clearly, seniors' homes are an issue.
Right.
And I think one of the issues that we haven't heard much about yet, and we're only starting to hear about, is prisons. And I fear that there's going to be other places where the epidemic goes crazy, and it's going to be in places where people are in close quarters.
Well, we saw Participation House. We're seeing an active movement on Twitter. You know, where's Bill Blair when it comes to prison? So the conversations have been happening. It's just who is listening? Who in power is going to have the guts or the fortitude to be able to say, I will take on this. I will discuss this. I will look into this. Who is going to do that?
Well, that's why we need you back in Parliament, because you've got the guts.
I knew you were going to say that. I knew it.
So, Celina, this has been a fascinating conversation. I've got your resume. You won business awards. I haven't been able to ask you about that. I want to have you come back on my show, and we'll talk about everything else. But before we go tonight, we've only got a few seconds left. Do you have a message for Canadians that might be listening and watching tonight?
I just say, let's just go through this with a degree of humanity and compassion. And I think that should say it all to our healthcare providers, our frontline workers. Remember that we are all humans and we should be treating each other with compassion and humanity, and we'll get through it.
Well, that's the Brian Crombie Radio Hour for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Celina, you were wonderful. Good evening.
Thank you.